Wait, how does this work?
You just press the button.
This one?
No, not that one.
You're listening to Press the Button, a Plowshares Fund podcast dedicated to nuclear policy and national security.
Everything seems impossible till it happens.
Everyone would be affected by a nuclear war.
Our government is planning to spend trillions of dollars to develop new nuclear weapons that we don't need.
You can't win a nuclear war.
We are all experts on nuclear weapons because we are all going to be affected by those nuclear weapons.
And here are your hosts, Joe Cirincione and Michelle Dover.
Welcome back after a long Martin Luther King Jr. holiday. Martin Luther King believed that the development and use of nuclear weapons should be banned. And so do we. And it's in that spirit that we bring you this 41st episode of Press the Button.
We'll start with early warning, in which we'll talk about the presidential candidate debate last week, the future of U.S.-Russian arms control, and Iran. After that, today's question comes from Ariel in Maryland. We'll be asking Joe about a potential upside of nuclear weapons.
And for our interview, Michelle and I will talk with Kelsey Davenport, the Director of Nonproliferation Policy at the Arms Control Association. She joins us to break down Breakout, to discuss what exactly it means that Iran has the capability to build the material for a nuclear bomb. How long would it take them to actually build that bomb, and would we see it happening?
As always, if you like what you hear, please rate, comment, subscribe, and share. Your feedback is what makes this program better.
We have a lot to cover, and the clock is ticking.
And now, early warning, early warning, early warning, early warning. A 7-minute synopsis of this week's nuclear news.
Thanks, Del. Welcome back to Early Warning. Today I'm joined by Akshai Vikram, Hale Fellow here at Plowshares Fund, and Andrey Baklitskiy, Visiting Fellow at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. Andrey, your first time on the podcast. Welcome.
Totally. Thanks for having me.
You are also a co-host of a podcast.
Yes. In Russia, it's called Принуждение к миру, Peace Enforcement. So for the Russian speakers out there, please check it out.
And we have invited you on the show today to talk a little bit about your research, which has to do with U.S.-Russian arms control. So you both know how this works. We have 7 minutes to cover everything that has happened this week. Andrey, you gave a presentation at CSIS this week on the future of U.S.-Russian arms control, and you have a report coming out soon. We've talked about this on the podcast several times, and I would love to hear your answer. What happens if New START is not extended?
Well, if New START is not extended, the first thing that happen, I would get drunk, and a lot of people around the world would probably get drunk. The second thing, the context will matter. So New START will leave us without, for the first time in a while, any limitations and any information exchange on strategic arms control between Russia and the United States. So that's bad in itself, and that's sort of uncharted territory. But if our countries would still want to continue arms control, if we're still having negotiations, we're trying to figure out a new agreement, that would be bad, but not that bad. We had precedents when we had, these in-betweens, when one treaty lapsed, the next haven't started, so we know how to manage those things. If, however, we don't have any negotiations, and we don't have any interest from one of the sides, namely in this context, United States, to continue arms control, which there are some hints now, that would be really bad, because we won't have any caps on our strategic nuclear forces, we won't have any information exchange, we won't have any verification measures, no inspections, and we exchange a lot, and we verify a lot, which is very important for our respective security services, for example. They don't have to spy on each other. They just get information directly from the other party. And starting from there, if you don't have anything, it won't happen next day or in a week, in a month. But the longer it goes, you start planning for the worst case scenarios, because you don't know what's going to happen. You need to think about your national security. And when you start doing the worst case scenarios, you can see how this loop can start going further and further, and everybody will be reacting to the other side reaction. So the longer it goes, the worse it gets. So we really should start a real negotiations for, arms control treaty for the next one now.
We've talked on the show before about how the U.S., for the variety of reasons, the U.S. has not made an effort to restart those negotiations. I'm curious to hear why you think that Russia is now more willing to discuss arms control with the U.S. than it has been in recent years.
Well, the stakes are higher. We already lost the INF treaty without pretty much no real negotiations, just repeating the talking points on both sides. We might lose the New START, which is the biggest and most important thing. So this adds urgency, and Russia leaders from the highest level, including the president, were on the record saying we're going to extend if we can. We offer it to U.S., clean extension, no strings attached. The other thing is that we had a period of pretty bad relations between our countries in 2013, and since we had the treaty, the urgency was not so high. Then Russia was saying, maybe we shouldn't talk to those guys. Let's see who comes next. Apparently, the people who came next were no better in that sense. So, And also, Russia has been increasing its conventional forces, so it doesn't maybe fear that much what U.S. can sense toward it. And Russia has a new array of nuclear systems, which also makes it more comfortable with the way where it is. So it can afford maybe more to talk about arms control.
Thanks. Akshay, looking back here at the United States, we saw the Democratic presidential candidate debate. Following on the heels of the Soleimani strike, foreign policy was a hot topic. Did you hear agreement among the candidates?
So this debate had more about foreign policy and nuclear weapons than we've seen all campaign. And I think that there is an emerging consensus on the Democratic side about a new nuclear agenda. I think that you see a lot of the candidates talking about a no first use policy, about at least a sole purpose policy, that the policy in the United States should be that we should only use nuclear weapons if we are under attack or our allies are under attack and not as a first strike. We also saw candidates stand up for New START during the debate. We've seen candidates in previous appearances talk about the importance of the INF agreement. So I think that there will be a push if a Democrat does win to renew the agreement early next year. And we also saw, both on Capitol Hill and on the debate stage in Des Moines, support for diplomacy with Iran and North Korea. Both issues are ones where military force has been floated as an option. And I think that the candidates are realizing that that is a very unappealing one and that diplomacy should definitely take priority.
So that was actually going to be the third thing that we talked about, was where we stand now with Iran. The interview later in the show is with Kelsey Davenport on Breakout time and the role of the Europeans in this. But for both of you, I'm curious to hear, Akshay, what are you expecting in the coming weeks in the U.S. Congress? And Andrey, what does the future look like for the JCPOA?
So I would just say that Iran is going to be the vehicle by which nuclear weapons do not go away in this campaign. The candidates clearly have to care about this issue. A lot of them are senators, and they have obligations in that job to make sure that they hold the executive branch accountable. I think that also nuclear weapons have been used as kind of a gotcha question, that you've seen editorial boards press candidates on these issues. You've seen some high-profile stumbling by some of the candidates because they haven't gotten their facts right. I think that it's going to be an important commander-in-chief test in the weeks coming forward. And finally, I think that because this issue is very popular with the American people, that it's going to force candidates to keep nuclear weapons at the forefront of their campaign agendas.
Thanks, Akshay. I think you're right. And I think there's going to be, we saw the resolution that Tim Kaine has introduced. It now has bipartisan support. We're also expecting a veto, and there's going to be additional votes in the House. So we don't expect to see this going away soon.
Yeah, this is not going away anytime soon.
On the JCPOA, the one thing I would like to highlight is how resilient the deal appeared. Who would have thought that if U.S. withdraws and then Iran rolls back some of the limitations, the majority of limitations, the deal would be still around? The best thing about this is that we still have the possibility to muddle through till November 2020. And if there is new administration in the U.S. who maybe is more sympathetic to the deal, then you can just basically, with a snap of fingers, get everything back and keep rolling as it was before. The problem, of course, is get to the November. There are chances, and there are a lot of people who would want to kill the deal precisely so it wouldn't be resurrected after the new U.S. administration. But I guess it's still important to fight for it, because even in the current form, it's giving a lot. It's giving transparency, it's giving access. There are some limitations still, like on Iraq, for example, and other things. But the best shot we have to preserve it is just to have a template which you can basically restart from the new if it's gone, it's gone. And we'll have new negotiations for 5 years, which no one knows where they will lead us.
And on that both uplifting and depressing note, thank you both for joining.
Thanks for having me.
Letters, we get letters. We get stacks and stacks of letters.
Joe, ready for today's question?
Let's go.
Ariel in Maryland asks, nuclear weapons pose a grave existential threat to humanity, but isn't there an argument that says these weapons have actually helped to prevent a large-scale warfare between powers? Can you evaluate that? Is it a reasonable argument to make?
It's a reasonable argument, but it's wrong. And the reason is it extracts one factor, the existence of nuclear weapons, and uses that to explain a very complex global environment. So the argument is, and you hear this from nuclear weapons proponents, nuclear weapons have kept the peace. Since the dawn of the nuclear age, the great powers have not engaged in conflict. Therefore, the possession and threat to use nuclear weapons are essential to keeping that peace. But it ignores all the multiple things that we did since 1945, including creation of NATO, the World Bank, the European Union, the International Monetary Fund, the integration of the global economy, the use of conventional military forces to contain the peace as well as wage wars. In all these instances, you can look at this and you can say these are much greater factors in keeping the peace. For example, why is it that France and Germany have not gone to war? Something they did every generation before there was a France and Germany, when it was just Franks and Goths. It's not nuclear weapons that stopped these great powers. It's NATO. It's their economic integration, their political integration in the European Union. So do nuclear weapons play a role? Do they have a deterrent effect? Yes, they do. Do they give leaders pause in the fear that a conventional conflict could go to a nuclear conflict and therefore they don't want to take that risk? Yes, I believe they are a factor in keeping the peace, but it is a replaceable factor. There are other military means that could be used to help sustain deterrence besides nuclear weapons. And here's the greatest fallacy of all. Nuclear deterrence and this peacekeeping role is a great theory until it fails. And then it fails catastrophically. So you don't want to conclude that because I am alive, I will therefore live forever. We know that is not true. And just because we have nuclear weapons does not mean they will not be used and they will keep the peace forever. And when that theory fails, all bets are off.
Another week, another question. Thanks, Joe.
Thank you, and thank you, Ariel, for submitting that question.
Hi, I'm Alyssa Kareem, Development Associate at Plowshares Fund, the largest U.S. philanthropic organization dedicated exclusively to nuclear security. Did you know that for as little as $5 a month, you can help reduce the threat from nuclear weapons in the Trump era and beyond? We want everyone to know about this opportunity, especially Press the Button listeners. If you don't give already, please consider going to plowshares.org/donate to set up a recurring donation. Please choose an amount appropriate for you. 100% of your tax-deductible giving will be put to immediate use on a regular basis, supporting the smartest people with the best ideas for reducing and ultimately eliminating nuclear weapons, stopping their spread, and building peace in regions of conflict where nuclear weapons exist. Every dollar you give goes directly to the programs we support, with nothing subtracted for fundraising or administrative costs. Please, if you have not done so already, go to plowshares.org/donate to set up your recurring donation today. If you are already a donor, thank you for your support. We couldn't do it without you. No gift is too small or too large. Thank you.
Today we're going to talk about two very important multi-part questions. Is Iran racing to a bomb? And if so, how long would it take? And is the Iran anti-nuclear deal dead? And if so, are we heading towards a new war in the Middle East?
Fortunately, we have Kelsey Davenport, Director of Nonproliferation at the Arms Control Association, here with us to answer those questions. Kelsey, you just had a great article in Arms Control today, which people can find on the Arms Control Association website. So with that,
tell us, how worried are you? How worried should we be?
I'm concerned about the future of the nuclear deal, but I'm not alarmed at this point. I mean, to date, Iran's actions have been a very predictable response to the year-long pressure campaign that the Trump administration has waged against Tehran to essentially remove any benefits from their continued compliance with the JCPOA. Luckily for us, the steps that Iran has taken to date, they've taken very transparently. These steps have been monitored. They've taken steps that are quickly reversible so they can return to compliance with the deal if their sanctions demands are met. And when we look at these steps as a whole, they don't significantly increase the proliferation risk posed by Iran's nuclear program. So Iran could have taken much more serious steps that would have posed much more of a risk. But right now, I think this is a predictable response and that they're focused on increasing leverage at the negotiating table to gain sanctions relief, not dash for a bomb.
I want to get to this concept of breakout time, which Joe mentioned earlier. It's a term commonly used of how much highly enriched uranium that Iran would need in order to fuel a bomb. And I wanted you to, if you can break down breakout time for us. Critics of the agreement seem to always try to simplify this. We all remember Netanyahu's cartoon that he held up at the UN, but clearly it's much more complicated than that. Can you give us a background of how that is calculated?
Sure. So breakout is a commonly used term to discuss how quickly a country could produce enough nuclear material for one bomb. So I want to emphasize that this is about producing the fissile material. It's not actually about building the entire bomb. So even once a country has that material, they still have to convert it, and they have to weaponize it, and then mate it with some sort of a delivery system. So breakout time is not simply the time it would take a country to get a nuclear bomb. It's the time it would take to produce the material. And it's also the time it would take to produce the material for just one bomb. If we're looking at Iran, Iran does not have a nuclear arsenal. So what is Iran going to do with one bomb? So it can be a helpful measure for gauging how far along a country's nuclear program is, but it doesn't take into account the most important element, and that's intent. Is the country actually interested in pursuing a nuclear weapon?
And what are the various elements then that go into that calculation?
So first, if you have to determine if you're looking at the uranium route or the plutonium route. Now with Iran, breakout calculations are typically done looking at the uranium route because the nuclear deal really blocked Iran's pathway to nuclear weapons using plutonium, and Iran is still abiding by those provisions that keep that pathway blocked. So if we look at Iran's uranium pathway to the bomb, they would first have to enrich enough uranium gas to actually then convert that material to build a bomb. So right now, Iran is enriching uranium to less than 5%. That's a percentage typically suitable for nuclear power reactors. Iran would have to amass enough of that material, somewhere along the lines of 1,050 kilograms, and then take that low enriched uranium and enrich it further to weapons grade. Weapons grade uranium is more than 90% enriched material. So they'd have a long way to go. Right now, as I said, they're enriching to less than 5%, and their stockpile of low enriched uranium is for less than 500 kilograms at this point. So Iran's breakout is still probably about at 1 year or slightly less than 1 year. That 1 year breakout timeline was established by the JCPOA. So to date, the steps that Iran have taken have started to slowly erode that breakout time, but not shifted it significantly.
And Joe, I promise I'll let you ask questions, but I'm kind of want to get into this. Would we know? I mean, what are the types of things that would give us an indication if they were changing that? Because it's not just about the amount of material going through, right? There's a bunch of other factors that would have to come into play.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, once Iran produced material to weapons grade, it would then have to take that material, convert it into a metallic form, called the core of the nuclear weapon, essentially, and fit it with an explosive package. And any of these steps that Iran would take going forward, enriching additional uranium, enriching uranium to higher levels, all of these actions would be quickly detected by international inspectors. And that's one key element of Iran's performance under the nuclear deal that is typically overlooked. Iran has continued to allow inspectors in its nuclear facilities beyond what's required by international law. So it's continued to abide by the additional monitoring and verification mechanisms put in place by the JCPOA. And this gives the international community the highest possible assurance that if Iran were to further deviate from the deal or take one of these steps towards a nuclear weapon, that it would be quickly detected.
Michelle won't let me do this, but I wanted to talk about this, starting with how the element uranium is formed in supernova explosions.
Yes, we're all stardust. I know this.
but instead of doing that, as our colleague Corey Hinderstein had a good article in Defense One, where she talked about the various elements of a breakout of uranium enrichment capability as sliders that you would move. So number of centrifuges, amount of low enriched uranium gas, the enrichment level of the enrichment gas. So let me just walk through a couple of those. Where is Iran now on the number of centrifuges compared to where they were when they were in complete compliance with the deal a few months ago?
So under the nuclear deal, Iran was permitted to enrich uranium using 5,060 of its first generation centrifuges. Now, up until early January, Iran was still abiding by that limit. But with the January 5th announcement, Iran committed its fifth breach of the deal, and it said there would be no longer limits on uranium enrichment, including installed centrifuges. So it's likely that Iran is going to begin reinstalling machines that were dismantled under the JCPOA and enrich with those centrifuges. Iran also started enriching uranium with some of the centrifuges that it had at Fordow. Iran was allowed to keep just over 1,000 machines there, but that site was going to be modified so that it would produce medical isotopes. But Iran is reconstituting that facility as a uranium enrichment site. So it's unclear the exact number of machines they're using now, but it's likely to go up given Iran's recent announcement.
Right. But before the deal, they had almost 20,000. They had to rip out about 15,000 of them. So they're still a long way from the capability they had in 2014. By the way, just as an aside, these machines were not really designed to be mobile. I mean, these things are bolted into concrete platforms, and now they've ripped them up, moved them into a warehouse. Now they're going to move them
they're
back.
Under seal. So the IAEA will know when those machines are in motion.
So we will know, because the verification procedures will know exactly how many they're put in. So there's not going to be a surprise here, right? I'm worried about the delicacy of these things. About, can you just do this to a centrifuge? It's not designed to put on a pickup truck and drive it down the road and then put it on a pickup truck and drive it back.
Well, that is a big question. How many machines were damaged during the dismantlement process? Will they be functioning when they're brought online? And I think most importantly, what about the advanced centrifuge machines?
So what about that? So that's another slider. So the ones they're using, the IR1s, right? Pretty basic, way inferior to the kinds of centrifuges we used to use or the Europeans use. What about the advanced centrifuges? How many of those?
So Iran had installed about 1,000 IR2 centrifuges prior to the JCPOA.
And compare that to the IR1?
Those are believed to be 2 to 3 times more efficient. But since those machines never operated to enrich uranium, there's still some uncertainty as to how well those machines would perform. But Iran removed those machines under the JCPOA, so they also are in storage. So will those machines be reinstalled? That's another big factor when we look at how quickly Iran could ramp up its nuclear activities.
And how about the really advanced centrifuges, the so-called IR6s?
Well, Iran declared in September that it would no longer be bound by the restrictions on research and development of advanced centrifuge machines. And since then, it has installed additional machines, additional IR4s, IR6s, in excess of what's permitted under the JCPOA. And it's operating some cascades of those machines.
What does that mean? How many?
164 approximately.
And these are how, compare that to the IR1, how much more efficient?
Well, it's difficult to say. Iran typically gives estimates on efficiency, but those estimates are usually significantly more than how the machines perform.
They talk about their centrifuges like Trump would. Right? Best machines in history.
Yeah. No, but that's also, it's a point of huge national pride, right? I mean, this is one of the reasons where, the Trump administration's claims that they are going to get Iran to completely give up enrichment are really hard to believe.
Yeah. So let's talk about one of the other sliders. The amount of low-enriched uranium gas. So this has been enriched in the centrifuges and then stored. Before the JCPOA, they had about 10 tons. The deal required them to ship it out of the country, and they were allowed to keep 300 kilograms, which is really a token amount. Talk about Iranian pride. You can't do squat with 300 kilograms. Where are they now?
So Iran announced in May that it would no longer abide by the 300 kilogram limit. And since then, it has exceeded that limit. It exceeded the limit in July and continues to add to that stockpile. But as of the last IAEA report, which was issued in November, Iran had only stockpiled just more than 400 kilograms. So that bar has not significantly moved either. But when we're talking about changes sort of pre and post JCPOA, it's also worth remembering that Iran used to enrich uranium to 20% before negotiations on the JCPOA began.
That's my last slider. So go ahead. Where are they now?
Well, Iran was prohibited from 20% enrichment under the deal. And that really was a critical restriction because enriching up to 20% is 90% of the total work on enrichment that's done to get to weapons grade. So going from 20 to 90 is that additional 10% of work.
Let me just pause here to explain. In order to make a bomb, you need uranium that's enriched to something like 70 to 90%. We have our uranium is even a higher percentage. But in order to do fuel, you just need somewhere between 3.5 and 5% for fuel. So here's the basic problem. Iran says its centrifuges are just being used to make low-enriched uranium for fuel, but the same machines, slightly different configurations, can go all the way to 90. So the more gas that they store in this intermediate range, right, so 20%, the quicker they could put that back in the machines and whip it up to 90% to bomb grade.
Exactly. So when Iran was enriching uranium to 20% before the JCPOA negotiations, they had stockpiled enough of that material that the breakout timeline had dropped to 2 to 3 months in best case estimates.
Right. So Netanyahu actually was right with his Wile E. Coyote cartoon bomb on the UN, right? I mean, I thought that was true. They were getting up to that point where they could make enough material for one bomb in a matter of weeks. Whether it's 8 weeks, 12 weeks, but that was the standard.
Yes, and it certainly was concerning. I think it's slightly more serious than drawing a red line on a bomb with a Sharpie, as Netanyahu did at the UN. More complicated than that. Yes, but that was the concern. They were moving into the zone where it would have been difficult for the international community to stop Iran had they chose to pursue nuclear weapons.
Okay, so how much? What's their enrichment level of their stored gas right now?
Anywhere from 3.67% to 4.5%.
Okay, so this is all the stuff we have to watch. So now we have the sliders, right? Mm-hmm. So the number of centrifuges, the quality of the centrifuges, the amount of gas, the enrichment level of the gas. So now what's the net assessment? And let me read you what the Israelis say. And remember, the Israeli intelligence and military establishment is often quite different from its political establishment. So it's not the same as what Bibi Netanyahu or his supporters here in Washington, D.C. are saying. And they are hyping, in my view, hyping the threat right now. But here's what Israeli intelligence says, just reported a few days ago, that they believe, Israeli intelligence believes, that if Tehran continues its nuclear program at their current projected rate, it will be capable of producing 1,300 kilograms of low-enriched uranium in order to get 25 kilograms of highly enriched uranium by the end of this year. What do you think of that assessment?
I think it's a fairly accurate assessment. And again, that supports what Iran says its intentions are in breaching the deal, namely that it's taking these steps to put leverage on Europe, not dash to a bomb. So when we look at all of those sliders that you mentioned, Iran has given itself considerable flexibility going forward. If Iran wants to significantly ratchet up its nuclear program, it can do so. If Iran wants to continue to slowly chip away at that breakout time and try to buy time to preserve the JCPOA going forward, it can also go down that route.
So the Israeli assessment continues, according to the Jerusalem Post. It would take another 2 years for the regime to develop the capabilities to make a missile capable of carrying a nuclear warhead. And this is to your point. Making the material is just step one in making a bomb. What do you think of that assessment?
Well, I think there are some assumptions that go into that assessment that may be difficult to unpack without additional information. And it also depends on what type of device you're concerned about. Are you concerned about Iran having an explosive device that it could deploy somewhere, or are you concerned about a device that could be fitted on the tip of a ballistic missile and accurately launched at a specific target? So depending on the threat, those assumptions are going to play into how you calculate that time frame and the type of device you're talking about.
Right. If they wanted a crude Hiroshima-type bomb that they could put on a ship and bring into New York or Haifa, that might be less time. If they wanted a ballistic missile warhead, years.
Exactly. Yeah, because when you're talking about building a device that fits on the tip of a ballistic missile, you have to be much more concerned about the size and the weight, because the ballistic missile actually has to be able to carry that warhead.
And testing?
Well, absolutely, you should be concerned about testing. I mean, Iran has not conducted a nuclear test, even though the U.S. intelligence community has assessed that Iran has a nuclear weapons capability. So the United States believes that Iran could build that weapon, but untested, there's significant variances of whether or not they could actually do this.
And finally, the Israeli assessment goes to the issue of intent. And here's what they say, again, according to the Jerusalem Post. Iran is not currently interested in rapidly developing an atomic bomb, but would rather see a return of all countries, especially the United States, to the nuclear agreement signed in 2015.
I absolutely think that's correct. I think every step that Iran has taken to date indicates that they want to preserve the JCPOA, but Tehran, like Washington, is subject to domestic factions. So Rouhani was under considerable pressure to respond to this concerted U.S. pressure campaign to cut off any benefits of Iran from complying with the deal. So I think it's very clear that the slow, reversible steps that Iran has taken, that they are signaling what they're going to do in advance, and that they have inspectors watching every move, is indicative of a pressure campaign, not a dash to a bomb.
With all that going on, getting back to one of Joe's original questions, is the deal dead? I mean, the Europeans have just announced that they are triggering a dispute resolution mechanism, which could lead to the UN snapping back all sanctions in 60, 65 days.
So the deal isn't dead yet, but it certainly could be. And a lot of that depends on how the Europeans manage this dispute resolution mechanism process. So the dispute resolution mechanism was set up in the JCPOA to resolve any allegations of noncompliance. And essentially, members of the JCPOA will meet and they will try to address the issue. And if they can't, the ministers will meet. And they can also invite an independent advisory opinion on how to resolve the crisis. Now, if this period ends without a resolution, then the matter could go to the UN Security Council. And what the UN Security Council could do is reimpose all of the UN sanctions that were lifted as part of the JCPOA. Now, the Europeans have made it very clear that they're interested in resolution, not punishing Iran for these actions. So they could continue to extend the dispute resolution mechanism periods, because those time periods periods can be extended by consensus to try to create a more intensive negotiation with Iran to resolve this dispute and ideally hang on to the JCPOA through the next presidential election. And I think it's clear that that's what the Europeans are going to try to do. But again, this is a risky move. They could lose control of this process and increase the risk of Security Council sanctions being reimposed, which would certainly kill the deal.
It struck me exactly the same way, that I think the Europeans, their intention is to rescue the deal by trying to put pressure on Iran. But in so doing, they may blow up the deal, particularly because of the news that Trump threatened to put 25% tariffs on European auto imports to the United States if the Europeans didn't do this. Doesn't that put the Europeans in a very difficult position? Don't they look like the Three Stooges to Trump? You know, this is France, Germany, and the United Kingdom. They seem to be marching to Trump's tune.
Well, I think that's exactly what it does. And this is a point that I think should be front and center in all of the discussions about the JCPOA, is the reminder that Trump started this process when he irresponsibly withdrew from the deal and reimposed sanctions in May of 2018 without consulting with allies and while acknowledging that Iran was complying with the accord. So again, this comes back to Trump and the extremely difficult spot that he's put Europe in. I mean, Europe has talked about the JCPOA as essential to European security. And here is the Trump administration trying to push Europe to act counter to their interests. At the same time, Iran is also making it difficult for Europe. As Iran began to breach limits in the JCPOA, it does start to gut some of the security value of the deal. And allowing Iran to remain in noncompliance with the agreement for extended periods of time does cast some doubt on the credibility of the agreement. So Europe was in an incredibly tough spot. I think they saw this dispute resolution mechanism as a way to signal to Iran that's enough is enough, but at the same time reiterate that they want to preserve the deal and find a way forward.
So what do you think the way forward is? Yogi Berra reminds us that making predictions is difficult, particularly about the future, but that's exactly what we want you to do. What do you think? Are we going to make it to the end of the year?
Well, I want to be optimistic and say yes. And I do think that there is space to preserve the agreement. But that's going to require further restraints on the part of Iran. And I think that's going to require the Europeans to do more to stand up to the Trump administration and risk sanctions in order to preserve legitimate business for Iran. There's been a lot of talk in Europe about wanting to come through on sanctions relief to provide Tehran with some benefits envisioned under the deal, but not a lot of action to date. And I think at some point Europe is going to have to stand up to Trump and say, we're going to take these steps to preserve trade. If you're going to sanction us, so be it.
We've spent so many decades in the Cold War period hoping that Europe stands down, and now we want them to stand up, and I think you're exactly right.
Kelsey, it has been such a pleasure having you on, and I know you made time for us just as you came back to work after having a baby. Congratulations, by the way, on your new addition.
Yes. Thank you. Yeah, it's been a very exciting 6 months since our son was born. We're having a lot of fun. But it's been, I admit, a challenge coming back to work. Balancing motherhood and work has certainly been a bit harder than I anticipated. But it's also been very invigorating. I mean, having a baby, thinking about the world that he's going to inherit has certainly redoubled my motivation to confront these challenges and hope that we leave him a better world than we have now.
Well, you're an inspiration, and I just have such deep respect for what you're doing. So we can't wait to have you back on.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to Press the Button. This podcast is produced by Delphine Vigil, Zach Brown, Derek Zender, Alex Spire, and Will Lowry. Sound design by Derek Zender. Audio engineering by Derek Zender and Will Lowry. Research by Alex Spire. Our theme song is by Lyrics Born and the Poets of Rhythm, sampled with kind permission. Additional music by San Francisco-based bands 17 Evergreen and the Society of Rockets. To continue the dialogue and support our work, visit plowshares.org.